I'm Michelle Ackerley. My parents both grew up on council estates, and as a family, we understand the difference social housing can make to people's lives. Millions of families across the UK are struggling to find affordable housing.
So this is my front room and my bedroom together.
Many are living in temporary or overcrowded conditions, desperate for somewhere decent to live.
This is our room where we sleep, and this is what we've got at the minute. We can't really call it our home.
But some social housing tenants are abusing the system, holding on to properties they no longer need.
When somebody applies for housing, you expect them to live in a property, and when they don't, it does start to take the mickey.
Or even worse, making a small fortune by illegally subletting them.
He was charging beyond £1,500 a month. He exploited this completely to his advantage.
So I'm with housing investigators cracking down on tenancy cheats.
What a waste.
If you want to commit tenancy fraud, don't bother coming here.
Reclaiming properties.
I need to speak to you, please.
They've seen an opportunity and they think they're not going to get caught.
And giving them to families in genuine need.
That's how a council house should be. It should be loved and looked after.
This is Council House Crackdown. Today, the failed asylum seeker who shamelessly swindled her way into social housing and £170,000 in benefits.
She is a devious person. She's planned this purely to get disabled money, access to housing.
Investigators uncover the truth about what lies behind a council tenant's front door.
It was obvious from just being outside the property, the strong smell of cannabis, that something else was going on at the address.
And neighbours helped to lift the lid on a woman's social housing scam.
It was the neighbours' view that the workers from her company were staying in the council house.
Every year, thousands of people across the UK join the waiting list for social housing. The vast majority of them are genuine, but some are lying about their circumstances in order to obtain housing by deception. And in just a few cases, that web of lies is so intricate, it can take years to unravel. Meet Catherine Boutin, a Turkish pensioner who blagged a council house and £170,000 in benefits.
Put two and two together, and it's quite obvious that she's now stolen somebody else's identity in order to carry on making claims for housing, claims for benefit, and to remain in the UK.
Croydon in South London. The housing crisis is hitting hard here. There are over 2,500 households, including those with young children, living in temporary accommodation, unable to afford a permanent home of their own. There's a desperate shortage of social housing, so the people living here in this council block of flats are among the lucky ones.
Well, as you can see, this block of flats is probably about 44 flats here. It's a lovely area, has a little private residential children's play area. All the flats are very well kept as well. So it's a block that you would have families in, would have single people, but overall a really, really nice area.
Back in 2005, Leanne Manning was the tenancy officer responsible for the day-to-day running of these flats. This woman, Catherine Boutin, was a tenant she remembers well. When did you first encounter Catherine Boutin?
So in 2005, when I was a tenancy officer, I did a new tenant visit at the property, at the ground floor flat that she lived in, to obviously make sure that it was the right tenant living in the property. I would have welcomed her to Croydon Council, explained what my role was as the tenancy officer, and explained her conditions of tenancy.
Catherine Boutin was claiming to be severely disabled and wheelchair-bound, and because of this, she'd been considered a priority when she applied for a council property. She presented a UK passport to prove she was resident here and entitled to social housing. Gail Campbell is Croydon's Tenancy Investigations Officer.
She was in a wheelchair and needed a specifically adapted property for someone in a wheelchair, which is a really sought-after thing in Croydon. What she accepted was a ground floor flat with a disabled access and an adapted bathroom so that she could use it with her wheelchair.
Catherine Boutin had grown up in Turkey, and Turkish was her first language. She proved to be one of Leanne's more difficult tenants.
This sticks out in your memory quite vividly, doesn't it? Why does Catherine Boutin stick out so much for you?
Yeah, I mean, she was a tenant that was quite demanding, and I spent a lot of time and used a lot of resources to deal with Miss Boutin. Since she moved into the property, she wasn't very happy. She wanted a bigger property, she wanted a nicer area, she wanted a garden, she wanted flower beds. A lot of demands that she wanted, even though the property that she'd been moved in was very suitable for her needs. So she would spend a lot of time complaining to me about noise, about neighbours, the problems, you know, in the block that she lived. And this would be in forms of letters, phone calls, emails from her. Obviously, I had to spend a lot of time investigating every complaint, because we've got a duty of care to do that.
For Croydon Council, the cost of dealing with these complaints was enormous in terms of time and paperwork.
Leanne, there was a huge amount of documentation here.
Yes, so this would be Miss Boutin's house file.
I mean, this is just stacks and stacks and stacks of paper.
Yes. So you'll see here, there'll be documentation that she's actually sent, and it's in Turkish. But obviously, I can't do anything with that until I send it off and get it translated. Every communication I had to have with her, I'd have to have translated. It cost us a lot of money to do that.
This is a lot of work, a lot of paper, a lot of time and energy that's had to be carried out.
It really just reflects all the demands, you know, that she kind of required. It all reflects in the size of her file.
Despite the complaints, Catherine Boutin remained in the property for the next 9 years. But in 2015, the Department for Work and Pensions started looking into Catherine Boutin's benefit claims.
The Department for Work and Pension received an anonymous tip-off that provided information that a person named Catherine Boutin was spending a lot of time outside the UK in Turkey, and that the trips over to Turkey were maybe a bit excessive.
The fact that she was apparently spending so much time out of the country meant that she may not have been eligible for the disability benefits that she was claiming.
Someone that's receiving disability benefits or any other benefit from the Department of Work and Pension should make them aware if they're leaving the UK, especially if it's going to be for an extended period of time. Normally, the benefit would need to be suspended.
As the DWP started looking into Catherine Boutin's background, they made a shocking discovery.
They gathered evidence from the Home Office that showed that the person that they were investigating, Catherine Boutin, was a failed asylum seeker, and that she had been served with papers some years before asking her to leave the UK.
If Catherine Boutin was a failed asylum seeker, it meant she wasn't entitled to any of the benefits she'd been claiming. And nor was she entitled to a council flat. Later, how Catherine Boutin fooled the authorities by pretending to be Scottish, even though she'd never visited the country.
She said it was too cold, and her GP said it wasn't a good idea for her to travel to Scotland. I really find that hard to believe.
Every day, in towns and cities across the UK, housing investigators are cracking down on tenancy fraud. They're determined to root out those who are cheating the social housing system and reclaim their properties. But sometimes, quite unexpectedly, they'll also uncover other criminal activities.
This next case involves an empty council flat and a slip of the tongue by a tenant's estranged wife, which leads investigators to call in the police.
Obviously, when somebody applies for housing, you expect them to live in a property, and when they don't, it does start to take the mickey. What we need is people who apply for council properties to live in them. That's the need, and that's what they're there for.
Sandwell in the West Midlands. A deprived area to the west of Birmingham, home to over 300,000 people, 7,000 of whom are on the council's waiting list for social housing. Some have been waiting up to 10 years. It means cracking down on tenancy fraud is a priority for Sandwell Mayor Steve Ealing.
We have a zero tolerance to people committing tenancy fraud. There is a significant demand, particularly for social housing in Sandwell. And tenancy fraud by people who are just not entitled to have a council house is actually depriving genuine applicants of getting a housing offer.
Oliver Knight is the counter-fraud manager for Sandwell Council. In 2012, his colleagues received an application for social housing from a man claiming he was facing homelessness after his marriage failed.
It would have given me a higher priority on the basis he was being threatened with homelessness. He needed to be housed urgently.
Even so, he was on the list for nearly 2 years before he was allocated a one-bedroom flat in Sandwell in November 2014.
There was no concerns, nothing suspicious about why he'd approached the council and his circumstances at the time.
It was a visit to the council by his estranged wife in August 2015 that ultimately led to questions over his tenancy.
She was living elsewhere in the borough and needed a discount on her council tax as a single person.
Anyone living alone is eligible for a discount on their council tax. But as the man's estranged wife made her application for a single person's discount, suspicions were aroused.
One of the council officers who she was speaking to came suspicious on the basis when she was making the claim, she constantly referred to we as opposed to I.
They suspected she may not be living alone and therefore was possibly making a fraudulent claim.
Anybody that approaches the council can apply for all manner of discounts, but obviously officers are trained to spot any indication of fraud. When that happens, they'll refer it to our fraud team, and our officers will then conduct checks to ensure if the claim's correct or not, basically.
Investigators were keen to discover if the woman's apparent slip of the tongue hid a bigger truth. So they began running credit checks and land registry searches.
Credit checks, it's social media, it's the run-of-the-mill stuff that people use on a daily basis. All those bits of information start to piece together, and it allows you to form a picture about what someone's circumstances are, where they're living, where they're not living.
While examining credit card statements linked to the woman's address, investigators made a surprising discovery. Her estranged husband had credit cards registered there.
They both had credit at the address, which suggested that he was still living at the address, despite having a council property elsewhere.
From the credit card statements, it looked as if, just a few months into the tenancy, the man was back living with his wife. If that was true, he should have notified the council of his change of circumstances and given the property back.
She wasn't entitled to that discount, and in addition that he'd been awarded the council property that he was no longer living at.
It was time for the fraud team to confront the pair with the damning evidence.
Initially, the investigation officer visited the lady in question at her property. She indicated that she was living there on her own and he lived elsewhere.
She was sticking to her story, but the credit card statements suggested otherwise. Housing officers then paid a visit to the man's flat.
There was no response from that address when we knocked the door. However, the officer did smell a strong smell of cannabis at the address.
Everything suggested the man was doing a lot more than breaching his tenancy.
It was obvious from just being outside the property, the strong smell of cannabis, that something else was going on at the address.
Later, the man's behaviour makes investigators even more suspicious.
But he was quite adamant that he didn't want to speak to us at the council property, which is obviously something we rarely tend to do. We like to see people at the property they're supposed to be living at, so we can assess whether they are or aren't using the property like they should be.
Earlier, we met fraudster Catherine Boutin, a disabled Turkish pensioner granted a specially adapted two-bed flat in 2005.
She was in a wheelchair and needed a specifically adapted property for someone in a wheelchair.
But 9 years later, she was exposed as a failed asylum seeker.
With her failed asylum status, she had no recourse to public funds, so that meant that anything that she was claiming was claimed fraudulently.
So how had a failed asylum seeker managed to con Croydon Council into granting her social housing? They began an investigation into their tenant, and a shocking web of lies and deceit slowly started to emerge. Investigators discovered she'd come to the UK as an asylum seeker.
The Home Office records show that in January 2002, she attended asylum screening in the UK. That first asylum claim was rejected. She made an appeal against that, and that was rejected as well.
Catherine Boutin had been placed in temporary bed and breakfast accommodation pending her deportation. But she was intent on remaining in the UK and applied for social housing in Croydon in 2003. However, as a failed asylum seeker awaiting deportation, that initial application was rejected.
So in order to qualify for a council property, she would needed to have been able to prove that she was a UK resident.
In order to access social housing, an applicant has to provide documents proving their right to live and work in the UK, such as a UK passport, a British birth certificate, or proof of immigration status. Being a failed asylum seeker and a Turkish national, Catherine Boutin had been unable to provide any of these documents. But in September 2004, she made a second application to Croydon Council, this time as a Scottish woman called Catherine Maloney. And even had a birth certificate to prove it.
This birth certificate's not a forgery. It's a copy of the original birth certificate that was issued when Catherine Maloney was born, and it was issued from the registration office in Dumbarton, Scotland.
It is possible to legally obtain a copy of a birth certificate, even if it's not your own. But what Catherine Boutin did next definitely wasn't legal. She fraudulently applied for a British passport. In her application, she claimed to be Catherine Maloney and was granted a passport in what she said was her married name, not Catherine, but Catherine Boutin.
She's got everything that she needs now to be able to access social housing and the benefit system. She's got the complete package.
Within months, she was allocated her two-bed flat in Croydon, and over the coming 9 years, claimed a total of £177,000 in income support allowance, housing benefit, council tax benefit, and disability living allowance.
Absolutely outrageous behaviour. She is a devious person, and she's planned this purely to get a gain at the end, which is disabled money, access to NHS, access to housing, without pretending she is this Catherine Maloney, the Scottish lady. She wouldn't be entitled to any of that.
In March 2014, Catherine Boutin was arrested at her council property and taken to a police station where she was interviewed under caution by Department for Work and Pension investigators.
Several allegations were put to her during that interview, and she was allowed via an interpreter to respond to the allegations.
She insisted that she'd been born in Scotland, but moved to Turkey as a young child.
When she was asked how come she grew up in Turkey, The so-called Catherine Maloney said that her mother had had an affair with a doctor who went to live in Turkey, and he took her and her mother over to Turkey to live. The mother only stayed there for a few months and left her child, her baby, with this man.
Investigators also asked her if she'd been to Scotland to trace her family history.
She said it was too cold, and her GP said it wasn't a good idea for her to travel to Scotland. I really find that hard to believe. And it's not too cold in Scotland, it's really nice in Scotland. I think she's read that in a book, maybe.
Following the interview, the DWP cancelled all her benefit payments, and Croydon Council started proceedings to get their property back.
We went to court and were ordered the possession order, which we then followed on with an eviction warrant, and we evicted her from the council property.
After 9 years of Catherine Booton's deception, Croydon Council had got this precious social housing property back.
A disabled adapted property is sought after, so we would have a number of people high priority waiting for that property to move straight in. We were able to do a quick turnaround on that property, and we rehoused somebody within a few weeks into that property.
The housing waiting list is huge. Social housing properties are in such high demand. How do you feel about people like Catherine Booton that are going to such lengths to deceive you and I, completely cheat the system?
So it's just not acceptable. There are genuine people out there that are in need of social housing. For someone like Miss Booton to go to the lengths that she did, it's just unacceptable. And I hope that people kind of will look at this and think, you know, this is not something you can get away with, and it's not something that the council, especially us at Croydon, we're going to allow and we're going to tackle as soon as we know about it. And we will use all the resources that we have to make sure that we get the good outcome.
In August of 2016, 14 years after Catherine Booton's asylum appeal was rejected, she appeared at Inner London Crown Court, charged with 3 counts of benefit fraud. She pleaded not guilty.
She decided that she didn't want to give any evidence. She listened to the evidence that was given. There was no challenge made, and the jury decided unanimously within a short period of time that she was guilty on all accounts.
Catherine Booton was jailed for 2 years and 6 months. But the authorities still haven't closed the case. They've discovered the deeds for 4 properties in the Bodrum region of Turkey, all in Catherine Booton's name.
It's a bit shocking to see that she's got 4 properties. She's obviously bought these as an investment, and we're going to seek now to recover those properties to offset the overpayments of the benefits and the housing benefit that she's obtained.
David Hogan is head of fraud at Croydon Council.
I've been investigating fraud for around 15 years, and, you know, I have to say I am still shocked. For me, it's the determination that she had to commit fraud, the determination to do the wrong thing rather than the right thing. The amount of resources from Croydon Council that she consumed in trying to commit this fraud, in terms of the staff time, the sheer number of complaints that we got from her.
Is it infuriating when you're dealing with cases like this, people acting, telling lies, constantly deceiving and draining the council of money?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating. You know, I accept people do wrong things, people take the wrong path at times, but, you know, when you get caught, put your hands up and admit that what you've done is wrong. People like Booton, who take this to the bitter end, by contesting the evidence that we got, she was simply draining the public purse further.
Personally, I think it's kind of disgusting, because there's people who live on the streets that have nowhere to go, and people who have to live in, like, temporary accommodation. They have nowhere to go, and they're waiting to get out of, like, a horrible little place to get their own place. And there's people like that who they get their hand just on a plate kind of thing.
It feels like But they've added extra months onto my own waiting time for a new property. Sometimes I feel that they've taken my property because they're ahead of me on the ladder kind of thing. It's absolutely appalling. It's disgusting.
They should get 5 years. I mean, the punishment's got to fit the crime. It's a serious crime. It's just dishonesty, it's greed, and it should be punished with a hefty sentence to deter other people from doing the same thing.
The historic university city of Cambridge, voted one of the best places in the country to live. But with house prices averaging around £500,000, many of those who work here can't afford to live here. The demand for social housing, even in this relatively affluent part of England, far outstrips supply. With around 11,000 people on the waiting list, it's vital properties are allocated to those who need them most. Our next case involves the unlawful subletting of a precious family home on the outskirts of Cambridge by a woman claiming to be a single parent in need of social housing.
Our issue was purely and simply, was she living at our social housing address? Because if she wasn't, we were keen to get the property back.
The story began in 2003 on a council estate just outside the city centre. It was here that I met Cambridge City Council fraud officer Chris Schofield.
So Chris, first of all, tell me about this area of Cambridge. What's it like?
Well, the area we're in here, we're 2 miles out of the historic centre of Cambridge. It's actually a purpose-built council estate, if you like, predominantly built for the residents of Cambridge to access social housing. It's a nice area, nice and leafy.
What are the properties like along here?
In the main, it'll probably be 2 or 3 bedroom houses. The idea was to try and house families, small families, etc.
When the single mother first contacted the council in 2003, she appeared to fit all the criteria to be housed in one of these family properties. She was given priority status and quickly allocated a 3-bed end-of-terrace house to bring up her young family.
As far as we knew, it was a legitimate tenancy, there was no issues, the rent was being paid on time and the council and everyone else was happy.
But nearly a decade later, in January 2013, the council's fraud office received an anonymous tip-off claiming that the woman was no longer living at the property. An investigation was immediately set up by Cambridge City Council's head of fraud, James Stevens.
Well, the allegation was that she wasn't actually at the property and that other people were. So the first thing we did was to go out to the property to see whether she was there and to validate the allegation itself. On the first occasion at the property, there was no one there. No one answered the door.
But neighbours were quite important within this case, weren't they? Because they helped to kind of give you a bit more detailed information about what was going on.
Yes, that's absolutely right. We visited the property more than once, and on the second time that we visited the property, the neighbours actually invited me into their homes.
What they told James gave him real cause for concern, that the property was being unlawfully sublet.
What they were saying is there were a number of people living at the property who shouldn't be there, and as a consequence, vehicles were being parked inconsiderately up and down the street, blocking access to their property.
The tenant was running her own business, and neighbours suspected that the unauthorised subtenants were her employees.
It was the neighbours' view that the workers from her company, or some of the workers from her company, were staying in the council house.
I see.
But at this point, we had no evidence.
Whatever the truth, it was looking as if their tenant was living somewhere else. The council checked their records and traced her to the nearby town of St Neots, where she was apparently living with her estranged husband.
We contacted the local authority that governed that particular area, and we asked them who was registered at the address. And they confirmed that the lady was registered there at the new address that we'd established.
This new address appeared to be a private rented property, so James contacted the letting agent.
They sent us a copy of the tenancy agreement relating to the second address that we had shown an interest in. And this actually had our tenant's name and her husband's name in there.
This was proof that she was directly linked to another address and not living at the property that she should have been living at.
That's absolutely the case, yes.
Later.
So with all this evidence, the next step was to interview her.
That's correct, yes.
Fraud investigators confront the absent tenant.
She indicated that she was living at the property. However, she's acknowledged that it, in her words, may look as though she wasn't living at the property.
Earlier we heard how Sandwell Council had awarded a council flat to a seemingly homeless man, only to find evidence that he was living with his estranged wife.
They both had credit at the address, which suggested that he was still living at the address, despite having a council property elsewhere.
But when fraud officers paid a visit to the man's council flat, their investigations took a further twist.
There was no response from that address when we knocked the door. However, the officer did smell a strong smell of cannabis.
When they contacted their tenant, he did little to alleviate their suspicions that he wasn't living in the council flat.
But he was quite adamant that he didn't want to speak to us at the council property, which is obviously something we rarely tend to do. We like to see people at the property they're supposed to be living at, so we can assess whether they are or aren't using the property like they should be.
Reluctantly, fraud investigators agreed to meet him at his partner's home, where they presented him with their evidence.
Within about 10 minutes of speaking to him at that address, it was obvious that he wasn't living at the property, and he'd admitted that to the council officer.
It turned out the man was living with his wife in a property they'd bought together during his tenancy without informing the council. Realising the game was up, the man agreed to give up his council flat. But he wanted 6 weeks to clear his belongings out and hand the keys back. Officers suspected he was still hiding something.
Usually we'd given anyone a tenant who was moving out the property up to 4 weeks. Anyone who asked for a bit longer than that, it would be unusual, especially in this case where he wasn't living at the address.
The request for extra time to vacate the property only added to investigators' suspicions that it was being used to grow cannabis. They immediately contacted the police.
Within about a week of that, the police had gone round and raided the property.
As the police entered the flat, the shocking truth of what lay inside was quickly revealed. A council property allocated to an apparently homeless man had been turned into a cannabis factory.
When the police raided the flat, they found a number of cannabis plants, 42 in total, at various stages, looking from the smaller ones to slightly larger plants.
The number of plants growing inside indicated the flat was being used to produce substantial amounts of cannabis.
They estimated a value between £35,000 and £40,000.
Fraud investigators had their own theory as to why the man had asked for an extra 2 weeks to vacate the property.
It would appear that he was asking for that so the smaller plants could mature into the larger ones that we can see there, and he could basically empty the crop from the property.
The police arrested the tenant and questioned him. He denied that the cannabis was his, and he was released without charge. Inquiries are ongoing. As for the council flat, that's been awarded to a deserving applicant on Sandwell's waiting list.
Obviously, when somebody applies for housing, you expect them to live in a property, and when they don't, it does start to take the mickey. Because really what we need is people who have applied for council properties to live in, and that's the need, and that's what they're there for.
This flagrant misuse of a council property may have gone unnoticed were it not for the tenant's wife.
Had she been a bit clearer and suggested she was living on her own, our concerns would never have been raised. It would never have been passed to our team. Despite all the thought that has gone into committing a fraud, it's the silly things sometimes that let people down. And in this case, it was something a case of we rather than I.
Earlier, we heard how Cambridge City Council awarded a 3-bedroom house to a single mother in need of somewhere to bring up her young family.
As far as we knew, it was a legitimate tenancy. Rent was being paid on time and the council and everyone else was happy.
But nearly a decade later, fraud investigators discovered she was apparently living 20 miles away with her estranged husband and subletting her Cambridge council house.
They sent us a copy of the tenancy agreement relating to this second address, and this actually had our tenant's name and her husband's name in there.
So with all this evidence, the next step was to interview her.
That's correct, yes. Our issue was purely and simply, was she living at our social housing address? Because if she wasn't, we were keen to get the property back so that someone else who needed the property could live there.
Suspected of unlawfully subletting her property, the woman was interviewed under caution. Initially, she denied living with her husband in St Neots.
She indicated that although she was on the tenancy agreement with her husband, it was simply because he had a poor credit rating and it meant that he could get a tenancy and she wasn't living with him.
The woman was adamant she was living at her council house in Cambridge.
She indicated that she was living at the property. However, she acknowledged that it, in her words, may look as though she wasn't living at the property.
Despite her denials, the tenant was doing little to allay suspicions. Then she came up with a rather unusual suggestion.
What she suggested was that perhaps a solution to the problem would be for her to buy the house from us.
So she was looking for some sort of deal, potentially.
She certainly indicated that she would be prepared to buy the house from us. We were not keen to do that, apart from anything else, because we had a belief that she wasn't living there. So under the right to buy scheme, you do have to be resident of the property in order to qualify to buy the council house.
Across the UK, more fraudulent right-to-buy applications are being detected than ever. The number of investigations was up 400% in 2016.
We felt that under law she had no right to buy the house from us, and we had a priority of making sure that people who were on the housing list would get the first opportunity to acquire social housing in Cambridge.
Faced with all the evidence, the woman finally agreed to relinquish her tenancy.
I had extensive conversations with the lady. She acknowledged the situation, how it might appear, etc. And in the end, she decided, following our conversations, that the best thing to do was to give the keys back, to move out of the property, or if she was not living there, to move whomever was there out of the property.
This 3-bedroom property on the outskirts of Cambridge has now been relet to one of the thousands of families on the waiting list.
We've achieved what we needed to. We've provided a home for someone who was going through the process, the appropriate process. They applied to be housed, they waited their turn, and in the end, a nice house came up and they got it. And that makes me very pleased because we were able to provide that home.
Properties are in high demand, and especially in a city like Cambridge where the rents are so very high. I'm very happy personally that we can release another social housing property to the people of Cambridge and to the people that need it most. You know, we do what we have to do and to make sure we get the right result for us and the council and the community as a whole.
The housing crisis is affecting almost every part of the UK, but nowhere more so than London. The shortage of social housing in the capital city is so severe and rents in the private sector so high that thousands of people stuck in temporary accommodation are moving out and relocating to other parts of the country.
An increase in demand is continuing to drive up property prices and private rents, with the gap between London and the rest of the UK wider than ever. In the capital, private rents are up to 3 times higher than they are in other parts of the UK. Vanessa Ashawe is living in temporary accommodation with her 2 children in Croydon, South London.
Obviously, I don't like it because it keeps me in limbo. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know, in terms of schooling, nursery for my kids, in terms of work. There's so many different things there that people don't, obviously, I suppose, as a housing, they're not really thinking about that.
Vanessa applied to Wandsworth Council for social housing in 2014 when her relationship broke down.
From the age I was 15, 16, I've always worked and I've always been able to stand on my own 2 feet and support myself and my kids. I've never ever relied on social housing before. This is the first time. It can happen to anyone. You just never know.
Vanessa and her 2 children have been living in this 2-bed maisonette for the past 2 years. The rent here is £260 a week.
In London, even though you have 2 boys, and though my son is 17 and James is 2, there's a big age gap, but because they're the same sex, you can only have a 2-bedroom property. So that means that me and James both have to share this room. I just don't have the luxury to spread out in my own bed the way that I would want to.
Even though she's lived in Croydon her whole life, Vanessa is now planning to move away, leaving behind everything and everyone she knows. She signed up with Home Finders, a company that helps place people on the social housing waiting list in different parts of the UK.
Manchester, Liverpool, Cumbria, Wales, whatever it is, it just works out to be so much cheaper. 3-bedroom house property there is about £400 a month. It's amazing.
Vanessa regularly checks online to see what social housing properties are currently available across the country.
There has been a property that I've seen that I love, which is the one in Carlisle. It's a 3-bedroom house. It's close to local shops and schools. It has a large family kitchen. It's got a front and back garden. I mean, I can't compare what is on this to what I have now because there is no comparison at all. This property is saying it's £386 a month, and my property is 200-something pounds a week. There is no comparison towards it.
Vanessa is convinced her decision to leave London is the right one for her children.
I think as a 2-year-old, he hasn't started nursery or anything yet, so this is the perfect time for me to move.
The chance of a home she can afford has finally given this single mum hope of putting down permanent roots after so long in temporary accommodation.
I've got thoughts of how the property is going to be, what it's going to be like. I've got ideas of decoration in my head and so forth. I mean, I've kind of just, thought a lot about it. I am excited about the future now. I've had such a hard time for the last couple of years, should I say, that it's really been so tough. And now to move somewhere and start something new, start a new life, that's how I see it, It's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it, so yeah.
With so many young families stuck in desperate situations, the work of housing investigators as they root out tenancy cheats and reclaim their properties is more important than ever.